Let's spare a moment and make dua for our fellow Muslim brothers and sisters who may be suffering around the world. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestow His infinite mercy and blessings upon the entire ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. You know, if an average individual was to be asked to list the rights of his employer upon him, the answer would be readily available. Similarly, if one was to be asked about the rights of his spouse or children, in fact, even asked about those, for example, his pet or an electronic device, a second's thought would not be required. But if the average Muslim is asked about the rights of the Quran, Allah's gift to humanity, that book which we claim regulates our life, we find that many of us struggle with this answer. And if this problem is not solved, there are consequences. So we must, therefore, attempt to transform these consequences into opportunities before the day arrives when the Quran will make its voice heard. So we as Muslims, we believe the Quran is important because it's a divine revelation. It's the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It has been revealed, brought down by the angel Jibreel alayhi salam, and it has been conveyed through the blessed tongue of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who is the last and final prophet and messenger. And this is a divine guidance for us, the Quran. And it holds a huge weight and influence for a Muslim. And the laws that it lays down are the means of attaining Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure and Jannah. In the Quran itself, the Quran, it explains the purpose of life, the purpose of everything's existence. And Muslims believe that this is not the result of any man's effort. It's a divine revelation and an inspiration for every Muslim. In the Quran, you have various topics that have been discussed, which in essence is a complete way of life for an individual. And some have gone as far to say that the Quran is powerful enough not just to govern a country, not just enough to govern a continent, not just powerful enough to govern the entire earth, the world, but the Quran is powerful enough to govern the entire universe. This is the Holy Quran, which the Muslims hold very dearly to their hearts. The Quran teaches us about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this has been emphasized in many areas throughout the Holy Quran. To believe in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has no partners, who has no family, who is not likened to any of Allah's creation. Allah is He subhanahu wa ta'ala who cannot be compared to anything or anyone. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is He who is free from time, from place, from form. That is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran, it teaches us moral, social, and spiritual values. The Quran, it makes one ponder on the creation of the entire universe. Look at the stars, look at the sun, look at the moon, Look at the direction of the wind. Look at the clouds. Look at the small ants which march like an army of troops. Look at the bee which extracts from a flower and produces honey. Look at the snake which stings and extracts poison. This is all the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran explains this. The Quran presents Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as the perfect role model for mankind. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Laqad kana lakum fi Rasulillahi uswatun hasana. Sadaqallahul azim. Indeed, in the messenger, in the Habib of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the perfect example for you. The Quran tells us that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was not only sent as a mercy to the believers, but Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was sent as a mercy to the entire alameen, which is the universe. Not just mankind, but everything. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has been referred to rahmatul lil alameen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to himself as Rabbul Alameen, the maintainer, the sustainer, the cherisher, the provider of the entire universe. And the Quran also mentions prophecies. It clearly speaks with precision about what will happen in the future. For example, the fall of the Roman Empire, the second coming of Jesus Christ, Isa alayhi salam, the foretelling of the coming of Gog and Magog, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, the corruption and the pollution of the earth, and some amazing scientific discoveries, which the Quran foretold 1500 years, 1400 years ago. And there's many other prophecies which are mentioned in the Quran. And till today and up until Yawmul Qiyamah, the Quran has been preserved and is protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. And the Quran, it has an impact on our everyday life. The Quran strongly forbids bad behavior, consuming alcohol, drugs, selfish habits like sexual indecency, adultery, gambling, taking interest, jealousy, backbiting, arrogance, and anger. The Quran teaches to give up these for sanity and happiness. And whoever is trapped in these vices, they are in the degrading cycle of evil. And it makes not only their lives miserable, but the lives of others as well. And the instructions in the Quran are very, very strong. You have clear-cut instructions in the Quran. And the teachings of the Quran can stand up to anything which is either scientific or moral. And there are many evidences throughout the Quran to manifest that this is a divine revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Quran, as mentioned earlier, the Quran has rights upon us. And if we are asked about our employer's rights upon us, we refer back to the contract that we have signed prior to employment. If we are asked about rights of any other object or being, we are ready to provide a list. But how comes when it comes to the question that what rights does the Quran, the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the living miracle of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, which is present with us today, how comes that when that question is raised, what rights does the Quran have upon every single one of us? How comes we are unable to answer this? I will briefly list the rights of the Quran upon every single one of us. Number one, to believe in the Quran. To believe in the Quran that it is the divine revelation, the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, revealed through Jibreel alayhi salam to our holy prophet, the last and final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, uttered through the blessed tongue of the best of creation, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. To believe in the Quran. Number two, to respect the Quran. So as you may be aware, since I was a child, I have never ever seen the Quran placed at a low place. Never. It's always placed at a high place. It is always covered in a cloth. It is always respected. And we have been taught since childhood that we are not allowed to touch the Quran without performing ablution, without performing wudu, without purifying ourselves. We are not allowed to touch the Quran. So respect, utmost respect of the Quran. And another thing, if the Quran is being recited in your presence, it is obligatory upon you to pay attention to the Quran. And the ruling slightly changes when there's more than one individual listening to the Quran. How? Now, if there is a group of people sitting there and the Quran is being recited, at least one of them should be paying attention to the Quran. Number three, recite the Quran. Recite the Quran. This is one of the rights of the Quran, that it should be recited. Number four is what you recite, you act upon it. So these indecencies that the Quran forbids you, you refrain from that. The commands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands you, you fulfill those commands. So you act upon it. Number five, you become steadfast. You have istiqamat in the laws, the acts that are done according to the Quran. You become steadfast in the teachings of the Quran. And number six, very, very important. Why? Because one of the questions on Yawmul Qiyamah is, what did you do with the knowledge that you acquired? What did you do with the knowledge you have acquired? When you stand like this, unable to move until you answer 5 questions, one of those questions is, what did you do with the knowledge that you acquired? Now, if you are reading the Quran, you are believing in the Quran, you are respecting the Quran, you are reciting the Quran, you are acting upon the Quran, and you are becoming steadfast in the Quran, but you lack the last, it can be a source of a major problem for you. What did you lack? The propagation of the Quran. To spread the teachings of the Quran. So knowledge that you acquire is an amana, it's a trust from Allah to you. And like your wealth, others have a right. Others have a right from the knowledge that you have gained. So to save yourself and your fellow Muslims, propagate the message of the Quran. These are the 6 rights that the Quran has upon every Muslim. And today, when the Quran is dishonored, disrespected, those who understand the value of the Quran are deeply, deeply disturbed. Those who know the essence and the importance and the value of the Quran, they are deeply disturbed. And they are unable to restrain their emotions. And their emotions come out and they make their voices heard. If all the Muslims start to understand and start to respect and honor the Quran, this in itself will be our retaliation to those who disrespect the Quran. The more you suppress, the more we rise. The more you burn, the more we will recite. This should be our response. So the reason of my talk today, based upon this, is to remind us that the Quran is the living miracle that we have, that will be with us until Yawmul Qiyamah. And if we Muslims, we don't take this as a blessing, Allah may take it away from us. The knowledge of the Quran, the ability to be able to, in this Darul Harb that we live in, non-Muslim state, we have no restrictions. You could be in the underground sitting on a train and you could be reciting your Quran. No one will say nothing to you. You will be reciting the Quran, praying on the street. No one will say nothing to you. And there are our Muslim brothers and sisters around the world. If they are caught with a copy of the Quran, they are imprisoned. They are tortured. If they are caught carrying the Sunnah, the beard of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they are imprisoned. They are tortured. We have no restrictions. Don't take this for granted. May Allah allow us to act upon the Quran and the Sunnah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. May we be a source of guidance for the entire mankind. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gather us all in Jannatul Firdaus, in the neighborhood of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Wa ma alayna illa